Interview with Gordon Lish. This was recorded June 29th, 1983 at WCBS. Lish, an editor at Knopf, is the author of Dear Mr. Capote. You live here in Manhattan?
You bet, yeah.
Whereabouts?
Up on 96 and 5th.
We're across the park from you. We live at 97 Park West Village, which is a large apartment complex at 97th Street in Central Park West.
Roy Blunt just moved up there, I think.
Roy Blunt did?
Yeah, you know who Roy Blunt is?
Yeah, I know. I didn't know he lived. He was living in Massachusetts.
He just moved down to New York.
He did.
He bought an apartment down here. Mm-hmm.
Incredible.
He's a funny man.
As a matter of fact, I just had him.
I believe so.
A couple of months ago.
Is that a fact?
Yeah.
He's a funny man, isn't he?
Oh, he's hilarious. It was. We talked about his book, One Fell
Swoop.
Bug on the Highway of Life.
What's that? Oh, yeah, that's
that's
a poem he wrote. He may have converted that into a book.
It was the title of a book of poetry.
Yeah.
And various essays. And
I published a book of his called Crackers.
Yes.
Which I insist is his funniest ever.
Matter of fact, I knew he was coming in. I didn't know it at the time I saw the book, but I saw a copy of Crackers in a garage sale for 50 cents.
Is that for?
And the next week I realized he was coming in. And so I went back. This was actually like a thrift shop at 106th Street in Broadway. And so I went back.
He used to have an apartment up there, though, maybe.
I didn't even know he lived in New York for some reason.
Kept an apartment on 106th Street, yeah.
So I think we'll just talk. I have a few questions I'd like to ask you about yourself and about editing, but mostly about the book, which I have to say on the outset I admired very, very much.
Oh, thank you.
And but I have some questions about it.
You bet.
And I'm glad you're here because there are some things I did not understand. Some things that I was confused about a little bit, and probably because of my own ignorance. I was not sure. One, he had me going. The narrator had me going because I think I assumed that perhaps he had been in radio at one point back in those early days of soaps. And then I began to realize that indeed he couldn't have been, and he didn't have the depth or the intelligence, the education, apparently the vocal range, and indeed at one point one of the other characters describes his job as that of a messenger.
Yeah.
With that in mind, I began to wonder if indeed he did commit all of the, I think, 23 murders, and I was not sure at the end whether he did. And was this something in my lack of perception, or what? Or was this meant to be somewhat up in the air?
So far as I can see, every reader's had it a different way. It is intended that one sees that he, in fact, has not killed anyone at all, that he's incapable of killing, that he would like to be able to do so, that certainly his ambition to kill enough people in order to generate an exciting enough story to provide for a bestseller in order to secure the future of his son is indeed a notion of his, but never really achieves any kind of reality. So no, he's not killing anyone, in fact. The clues to suggest as much are subtilized in the extreme. I think you mainly get it in a scene near the back end of the book when his wife is heard speaking, and she says in that peculiar voice, a voice that is peculiar to her, "No, you couldn't know off anybody." There's a couple of blankety-blank words back there. I can't give you the exact line, but I think that the indication is rather oblique, but there, that he's not, in fact, killing anyone. And now, how much of what he is telling you can be relied on as fact and cannot is difficult to determine. I would say certainly all the radio experience is false. He was a child who lived inside the radio. The program that he's most obsessed with, Young Dr. Malone, he reports his mother's favorite radio program. His connection with the radio in any kind of work sense was, as you reported, as a messenger, which job he gets through a man named Bill Lido, who is a staff announcer at Mutual. A long-winded answer to
That's all right. reference to, is it Brian? No. Buddy Brown.
Buddy Brown, yeah.
The reference to Buddy Brown. Buddy Brown never appears in the book. And I get the impression that he was the boy next door that the character's mother admired.
Yes.
Photograph
Yes.
there.
Yes.
And,
yes. The boy who was somewhat more beautiful than the narrator, yes. Yeah.
I didn't quite understand this. Was this character, this Buddy Brown, part of the reason for the, I hate to keep using the term character, but I don't believe he has a name, does he?
Yes, well, Davy, I mean, he talks about his brother Davy, but I think it's probably fair to say that the narrator's name is Davy. There is no brother named Davy. He is Davy.
Oh, boy.
That's all right.
I blew that one.
Every reviewer's had a different apprehension of that, but he does say at one point, or it's clear in one conversation with his mother on the telephone that he's Davy, that he has no brother drowned, as he reports to us. The boy next door, Buddy Brown, who apparently was a very fetching child and sought the eye of Davy's mother, and who sort of replaces him in her esteem, is in fact killed in an accident, which is probably not so much an accident as intention. There were children up on a top floor or the attic of an unfinished house playing Simon Says. Our narrator, Davy, is sort of the leader of the game, and through some contrivance in the game gets Buddy Brown to step forward into a shaft wherein a chimney was going to be laid in, and the boy falls down to the basement. So it's a kind of murder then, in fact. That's the one killing he has done.
T.C. confused me, because obviously Truman Capote, T.C., and then I began to realize he wasn't talking about Truman Capote, and it became apparent I had to go back, because I tend to read in paragraphs, and you have the kind of book that is not easily read in paragraphs.
No, sir.
And so you can miss clues very easily. And so I missed that when I had to go back and find out that T.C. was actually his wife.
His wife, Tamara Chris, whom he calls T.C., from Salem, Oregon, right, and whose initials aren't the same as Truman Capote's.
This obviously was deliberate. Why did you do this?
No, it really wasn't deliberate. It is the kind of thing that fascinates the narrator in his madness, as would any sort of coincidence. In my judgment, one of the things that characterizes insanity is the wish to see parallels and systems, to make systems out of things which are really unrelated and disparate. And so that Davy spends an awful lot of time in the course of the letter he's writing to Capote, finding connections between things which really have no connection at all. It is simply happenstantial that his wife's initials are the same as the man he's writing to. But he makes much of this, as he makes much of the fact that he has been writing also to Norman Mailer, and that in both the name Norman and in the name Truman, one can devise the word M-A-N. I mean, this also seems very significant to him. Everything seems significant to him, and it's been my observation that one of the things peculiar to psychosis is the finding of, or the imposing of middle terms on all sorts of absolutely unrelated elements. You see this often manifest itself in paranoid systems that would have it that the world is in the domination of a small group of conspiring persons, or that this event happening over here is somehow tied to that event happening over there, is tied to that event happening over there, and the whole thing makes perfect sense. In fact, in my judgment, doesn't make perfect sense. Things just don't have those causal relationships, and the fact that you can find in the names of two prominent American writers the word M-A-N is scarcely of any consequence at all. But it has enormous importance for our narrator, for Davy. He seems to see that as immensely implicit of some kind of meaning.
Davy has a lust, obviously, or at least an obsession with Janet Rose. I have the name right, Janet Rose?
Yes, that's it. Janet Rose, Janet R.
And yet, very little is mentioned except in the most oblique way of his wife. Did I miss this?
Well, he
Did
talks
ever have
about...
a direct... was it ever established where he had met his wife?
No, in one version of the book, I had laid in an episode where this improbable matrimony came to pass. I subsequently took it out, thinking it was simply a diversion. It had not greatly to do with what the book is about. The narrator's Davy's remarks about his wife have chiefly to do with the sexual relations between them, and with her failure, additionally, to relate to their son in a way that suits Davy. That T.C. is insufficiently attentive to his education, to his training, that she's not adequately observing of the family rule of safety first, that she thinks that he is absurd in his cautionary and his cautions to his son. As you may recall, the boy carries a walkie-talkie that the father has the mate of, and with him, and the father keeps tabs on his son in the course of the day, and the mother, T.C., the father tells us, thinks this is ridiculous behavior, and of course it is ridiculous behavior. But what I was saying is that T.C. is only important insofar as she represents a kind of antagonism for the peculiar madness of the narrator. And although T.C. represents a commonsensical point of view, I think one of the curious things about the book is that you tend to side with the narrator, who's quite mad, obviously, and whose point of view is truly absurd, and yet somehow it seems appealing, it seems to make sense. It seems to make sense to be as cautionary as he is and as paranoid as he is, particularly in the frame of New York City.
That's true. You feel a certain fondness for the narrator, because I think we meet so many people like that all around us.
Well, I think
in every facet of our lives.
One of the things that's been remarked about this book, and it pleases me that it's being remarked, is that because I did set out to contrive this effect, and that is that such a repugnant human being, if we take him at his word, is over the course of the letter he's writing to Capote made sympathetic. I think that does happen in most readings, and it's a remarkable thing to behold, because everything about this man is really repugnant. There's nothing about him that's appealing. He is, at his own word, an entirely ridiculous character, obsessed with silly things, petty, small-minded, bigoted, in any number of ways, insufficiently human and humane, and yet in the course of the book, it would seem from most of the reviews that have thus far been entered, the reader finds himself persuaded of the appeal of poor Davy.
Well, I believe that is the case, because all of us have these same prejudicial feelings, and I think all of us have small bouts of madness as we go about our lives, and all of us do things that may not be dissimilar to the character.
No, I would like to think so. And in fact, I must admit that in the course of creating this fellow's voice, I put in his mouth any number of observations that I would be happy to make myself.
I came to the chapter in which his mother speaks, and I was, I don't know that I was surprised, but his mother spoke in an identical way as the narrator.
Well, he's surrounded by cliche. Davy is, and I don't think this is really unlike the shaping of any of us. He's the result of the language that he's heard, and particularly the idiomatic expressions that fascinate any child. I was thinking on my way over here this morning of a remark my mother used to make again and again when I was a child, a place for everything and everything in its place. Just suddenly came to me that my mother used to say that all the time, and that it had a special kind of almost magical, incantatory effect on me. I liked that. I liked hearing it. The content of it meant nothing to me at all, although I understood it when I was a child to be a kind of scolding, that she was admonishing me to put something away. The repetition of the language and the neatness, the rightness of the language had a kind of very calming, satisfying effect on me. Just as, to now return to dear Mr. Capote, Ben Burney's sign-off has for Davy when he's a child. He hears this peculiar way in fact, a real band leader used to end his program back in the 40s. And it has a soothing effect on him, as does all these idioms and these cliches that are peculiar to his mother and peculiar to other people. So that what Davy is, what he is as an adult, a man 47 years old, is the sum of all these idioms, the sum of all these cliches. He can speak in nothing but cliches. And we eventually discover, when we hear the mother speaking, that many of these cliches derive from her. In fact, some derive from other persons in the book as well. And I think the bulk of us are the net result of the cliche we've been surrounded by. And I don't think that's necessarily an awful thing. I think, obviously, the point is made extreme in this book. But I think on careful examination, we find that the bulk of our ideas, the bulk of our impressions, the bulk of our ways of being in the world and ways of saying things back to the world arrive out of what's been programmed into us from our earliest perceptions, and most of these things are in fact cliches. In fact, the cliche is generally, in my judgment, not only a more readily adapted input, but also in a kind of way a more desirable input, in that it has, as I was suggesting earlier, a kind of shamanistic, ritualistic effect for us. It is calming. It is a social mechanism. It works. It's always worked, and we know it'll work for us, and it sort of places us in the world and protects us from the world. It's that ceremony of language that makes all sorts of human exchanges possible.
So to say, it's a form of shorthand.
Sure.
We have what we call institutional cliches that are used in broadcasting. Posh hotel, shark-infested water. These things make it easier for us to tell a story without thinking.
You bet. And Davy is just an extreme example of this. He can speak in nothing but cliches. But I think most of us speak in at least moderated cliches, most of the time, if not all the time.
Well, I have to say that this, Gordon Lish, you certainly put me behind in my work. Because my broadcast is every day. And as I started reading, I found that I could not hurry because you had a language all of your own in the book that required concentration and understanding. It was nothing that you could breeze through, and it required looking at almost every word and every line to better comprehend the character.
I wanted a voice that sounded like nothing else you'd ever heard before, and yet sounded awfully familiar in a kind of way. I wanted a book that was as erotic as I could make it. I wanted a book that was as shocking as I could make it. I wanted to do a lot of things toward that effort of taking the reader by the neck, seizing his attention, and forcing his face down onto the page. So I'm pleased with it. I think some of that effect has been achieved.
You have been an editor for quite a number of years. Did you find that you as an editor also needed an editor?
I certainly did, and I have the great good luck of having a first-rate one whose name is Billy Abrams. one of the things that astonished me in the course of the development of the book is that, contrary to my expectations, I was just as blind to the failures of the book, the excesses in the book, the insufficiencies in the book, as I have observed any writer that's come to me has been about his own book. I don't think an editor can edit himself, just as we are told no doctor should properly try to treat himself. I certainly was proved absolutely incompetent to see my book in the kind of light that I would see the work of someone else as an editor.
How did you set out to write, dear Mr. Capote? Did the character develop as you began to write, or did you have a fairly good idea of where you wanted to go as you started?
No, I didn't, Don. I had a kind of voice in my head. I knew roughly how I wanted this fellow to sound, but how you then translate that to the page is another problem. And I tried again and again and again to get it onto the page so it would look like what it sounded like in my head. And that took many, many, many tries. I must have made at least 100 runs at this book, getting into it anywhere from 20 to 100 pages, before I finally got the voice the way I wanted it. Where the idea came from was simple enough. I saw an ad for a book called Son of Sam, which was, in fact, the authorized biography of this fellow who's a mass murderer here in New York. It suddenly occurred to me, the advertisement expressed pride in the presentation of this book, that here was an event to behold, that money would be made from this, and that the persons involved with the enterprise were pleased with what was to be presented to the public for sale, as of course they should be. Here's a product. And that's, I think, where the idea came to me of a fellow who would get it into his head, that one way to, in a very excellent way, without much training in life and without much skill and without much prospect, to make a bundle is to start killing a lot of people and sell your story. And it occurred to me that notion may have occurred to a lot of people. Might right now be occurring to a lot of people. And here we have a fellow to whom it's occurred because he has heard some government broadcast or some government report saying that the generation that his son belongs to is going to have it worse than the generation that he belonged to, and there's just no possible prospect for this boy to live any better than the dad lived, and the dad lived pretty awful. So he sets out, because he is so devoted to this child, to kill a lot of people and sell his story to Truman Capote, to Norman Mailer. Of course, as I said at the opening of our discussions, he is not really killing anybody. It's something he would like to do. He talks about doing it, thinks about doing it. I think most psychotics practice their psychosis in the abstract. They don't really get out and act out all that much. They don't get out and kill people or do funny things in public. Probably the bulk of their madness takes place inside their skulls. But anyhow, that's how the idea came to me. And the problem I set for myself was to take a fellow like this, whom I thought was an ordinary enough fellow, and sort of decorate him out with a rather considerable array of disgusting mannerisms, and yet make him, in the end, a desirable, pathetic, sympathetic person. As a victim as much as a victimizer.
Gordon Lish, as you wrote, dear Mr. Capote, did you have any self... The book has been received critically, but did you have any self-doubts about it, that who would want to read it? Why would somebody want to read about this corrupt person?
Enormously. I tell you precisely how I felt at the completion of the thing. I knew that what I'd done was what I'd wanted to do, that the book was intricate in a way that I wanted to be, and it was sort of shocking in a way that I wanted it to be, that it accomplished those things. But I worried about the total effect. I thought it might look foolish, that I might look foolish. And I can recall passing the book on to an editor pal of mine prior to showing it to the fellow who subsequently published the book, Billy Abrams, at Holt, and asking my friend to read this thing and tell me honestly if he thought I was being silly. That was the one question I think I wanted answered. I was nagged by the suspicion that I was making a fool of myself. I've written a number of short stories, written many novels under other names. This was the first thing to come from my hand where I felt I may have gone so far as to be holding myself up to terrible ridicule. And I now think that probably that concern was a very healthy one, and in a way sort of was an index to the extent to which I had achieved what I've often argued as the most important principle in doing art, and that is to take every risk that you can at that time. I mean, I suppose I went about as far as I could go at the time I wrote that book, and that's why I was concerned that I'd gone too far. I don't think you ever can go too far. I'm writing a novel now that I've been at for about 3 years, a book called Dilation, and I'm finding that however greatly one wants to be reckless, there are certain very considerable limitations on one's abilities. You just can't be reckless enough. And I think it's important to be reckless if one wants to do art, if one wants to be serviceable. There's just too much clutter in the world, in my judgment, in relation to what's done as art. And I think if you want to do something, if you're determined to do something that is exceptional, and or that is at least unique, you have to go just about as far as you can go. And the great sadness is not that we are insufficient in our will to do this, but rather that we simply don't have the goods to go far enough.
Aren't you afraid what your mother is going to say?
Hugely. My mother is a woman virtually in her 90s, and she's not much of a reader anymore. My dad is a couple of years younger, and he's not much of a reader either. Both of these persons have the book in their possession. I hope that neither one has opened it up to have a look at it. I think their pleasure is simply seeing their son's name on the cover.
What about you have 4 children? What about them? Do you keep the book away, or are you old enough to understand the erotic areas in the book?
I've kept it away from my 11-year-old. I have a 26-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 21-year-old. They've all read it, and they all think Daddy's just a heck of a guy.
I go along with that. One other question. I could ask you questions for the next 2 hours, but unfortunately the time is about over for us. But you obviously are now a very successful writer with a critically acclaimed novel, but you are also an important editor. And have you found that being an editor in any way makes it more difficult for you to write?
It sure does. I am determined to say these things about those cases where editors write. I always took the position that it was a mistake for them to do this, that their own writers paid a price for it, that the writing they did paid a price for it, that it would be a good idea for anyone who wanted to be a writer, never to be an editor. And now I find myself in the position of having to try to justify doing the very thing that I've always decried as a bad practice, and a very common practice, too. As much as I would like to say that this new enthusiasm for writing has not interfered with my relation to my own writers, that's the case, I know in fact it's not. I know that a part of me is not available to them. I know that I read in a different kind of way now. I know that my ego has gotten in the way of their ego. There's no way you can do this thing, that is to say, write, and not be in competition with other writers, with all other writers. And that's an untenable position for an editor to have. So it's not a good thing, and I don't know how to resolve it. I certainly cannot see myself ever not being an editor. It's what I've always wanted to be. It's what I do best. On the other hand, I have a great commitment to at least finishing the book I remarked earlier, Dilation. I'm determined to do that. I have a collection of stories coming out with Holt next spring. I'm pleased about that, of course. I think after Dilation, I might have had my fill of this thing and see the wisdom of stopping it. I'm hoping to make that book everything that Dear Mr. Capote wasn't, so that I can have some sense of having said what I have to say and quitting it at that point. Because I would rather spend the last of my professional years as an editor, I think, than as a writer. Well, just to begin with, it's much more pleasant work. Writing is not fun, and I've always thought being an editor was great fun. In this respect, I will remark something that a piece of wisdom that once came out of Ken Kesey's mouth when he was talking about his explanation for why One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was such a fine book, certainly a fine book in my judgment. He said, it was fun to write. It was really fun to write. And I can't say I have fun writing, and I do have a lot of fun editing. I mean, and that's why I think I do it rather well.
Gordon Lish, will you make one promise to me when Dilations comes out? Will you come back so we can talk about that?
You bet. Be tickled to.
Thank you. Welcome back.
I'm amazed that they didn't send you a finished book.
Well, I tell you,
shame on them.
Dutton is not one of the best.
Good heavens.
In terms of their cooperation in trying to get material.
Good
if you hadn't
heavens.
sent me the copy, they never would have sent it.
Good heavens.
They never would have sent it. I would have had, if I hadn't received it, I would have called them and asked.
I will call them as soon as I get back to my office and make sure a copy comes over by messenger. Harold Bloom is quoted on the back, and Don DeLillo and Ann Tyler. And
I usually like to see how they come out, because there are a difference. And also, there are a whole bunch of blank pages.
There are. Oh, you have a bad one there.
Yeah, there are several. Well, there are.
You were on the list to get a first batch of finished books, and you never received them. Shocking.
I am used to working with publishers' publicity departments, and I would say that most of them are atrocious. There are some good ones. Coincidentally, and it's only a coincidence, I'm not saying this to you because you happen to be with Knopf, but Knopf probably has the best.
Yes.
Houghton Mifflin has an excellent one. Random House, which is, I guess, your parent, it's...
No, I know.
Doubleday is probably one of the worst in the industry.
Oh, and, shocking. Well,
Holt Reinhardt Winston, a CBS company, up until recently at least, it's terrible. I could never get anything. I mean, I called and asked them for material, and I would never get it. So it's, I don't understand it.
Well,
I don't know, maybe it's because they don't have training. I mean, some of these, they seem to be young women.
Yes.
And who seem to be oblivious to the necessity of promoting books.
Mm-hmm. And they don't follow through. They fail to make a note to themselves to do such and such, at a certain period of time. Forgive me.
No, that's all right.
All right. In any event, I will see to it that a copy is messengered over you tomorrow.
I would like to see the copy. I did, of course, enjoy the book. If enjoy is the term you use, I wasn't sure, but it is certainly consistent with Dear Mr. Capote and what I know so far, because you write so autobiographically, and yet there are things that maybe aren't autobiographical, and I'm never quite certain where the autobiography leaves off and the fiction begins. Maybe you could clarify that, or if it's possible to clarify that.
It's an easy question to speak to, because I would suspect that a chief aim of mine is to deliver the effect that the text is, in fact, scrupulously autobiographical. In fact, it's all invention. But part of the fun, I think, in delivering a book is to see how close one can come to producing that very effect. There was certainly in the beginning of the history of the novel an attempt to convey the impression that these works were documents, that they were in fact authentic documents, largely because people felt that the novel was a frivolous undertaking and one ought to be reading fact and not fiction. What I'm trying to do, I suppose, in a kind of way, is to revivify that ambition and to convey what in fact are strictly fictions as if they proceeded directly from fact, from history. But indeed, the book Peru is entirely a work of imagination. It is a novel.
Well, in that respect, or maybe in less so, it's like What I Know So Far, one of the short stories in What I Know So Far, and in Dear Mr. Capote. In both of those books, in What I Know So Far, in one of the chapters, there was an episode in which a young boy was killed in, I believe, a house under construction.
Yes.
And that also materialized in Dear Mr. Capote.
Yes, yes.
And I know from my previous discussion with you that actually happened in your own
yes.
existence, and
yes.
you felt haunted by that. So it would not be inconsistent for this to have also been something that might have happened in your young childhood.
Absolutely. Indeed, there was an episode in my youth, a squabble over a sandbox. I think it had to do with how the play would proceed in the sandbox. And a boy banged me on the head with a shovel in the chorus of that debate. And I think if there's any foundation in fact with Peru, there it is. In Peru, as you know, the narrator, who at the close of the novel is called Gordon, it's revealed that his name is Gordon, destroys a child, a neighbor child, with a toy hoe in the course of some play in a sandbox, in the neighbor's sandbox.
Well, of course, another way that you can throw off your listener, or reader rather, is that in your dedication page, you dedicate the book not only to your parents and for Dennis Donahue, I don't know who that is, but also to Stephen Michael Adenoff, who, of course, is in the fiction the victim of the attack by Gordon. Now, why did you do? Was there really an Adenoff, or did you make this up to throw your reader off?
No, there's no one named Stephen Michael Adenoff, insofar as I am able to demonstrate. No, I certainly did check around on that name. The name Philip Lish and Regina Lish do indeed denote my parents, although the dedication doesn't say they're my parents. But when you get into the book, you hear the name Phil again and again, and you hear the name Reg. The assumption is that these indeed are my parents. My position is this. Dennis Donahue, incidentally, is the most distinguished critic who lives in Ireland and teaches here in New York some time of the year. My position is that everything within the covers of a book that is presented as fiction is indeed fiction, so that there's no reason why the dedication oughtn't to yield itself up to the very same kind of play that the text at large has. In this case, the dedication is indeed a part of the novel.
Okay, I accept that. Well, I think something that was interesting to me is the picture of childhood in that period, which I guess is the late 1930s. Is that correct? Did I have that right?
Yes,
Maybe
yes,
you have that stated in here. I can't remember now.
38, 39, 40.
And it obviously takes place on Long Island.
Yes.
And there was an interesting reference where Gordon hears that somewhere out there in the neighborhood there are Christians.
Yes.
And he is afraid because I don't know what of, but apparently they were different.
Yes.
Was this the kind of experience that you had in your youth?
I must have had it, else I would not have thought of it. I mean, what Peru attempts in part to do is to delineate all the feelings and wild suppositions, confusions, ambitions that are present in a child of 6. I think it's easy for us to forget how our minds at the age of 6 were suffusions of one lunatic notion after another. And largely all of it was shot through with ideas of magic. The little boy in Peru believes that he can manipulate the world through various magical incantations. He thinks that he, in fact, can rhyme all the words there are, and that in so doing he becomes a kind of god. I think one of the things we all feel when we're children is powerless, and one way, I suppose, that we have of mediating between our powerlessness and the power of the adult world is to ascribe to ourselves various magical powers. And these largely come, I think, through deceptions with the language, confusions with the language, through notions that the language, if repeated in various ways, if uttered in various ways, will yield up magical powers to us. Peru is about the separate provinces of power and of powerlessness, and how all of us as children tend to bridge those provinces with the only means we have available to us, for the most part, which is a notion that magic can happen, that we can manipulate the environment around us to bring things out the way we wish them to be. The speaker in Peru, the narrator in Peru, is a boy who lives next to a boy who has moderately more things, more wealth, it would seem. He may not be rich, in fact, this boy who's called Andy Lieblich, but he does seem to have more than the narrator has. And in an effort to equalize the relation between them, even though he, the narrator, young Gordon, feels nothing but affection, indeed adoration for Andy Lieblich and all the things that have to do with Andy Lieblich, even so he has a need in him to sort of establish himself on some kind of equal footing. And this he believes he does by being better at things in the sandbox than is Andy Lieblich. He's a good player of the game Farmer, which is the game he likes to play. A game where you fill up a pail with sand and then overturn it and attempt to keep all the sand in one piece as if it were to give the impression of a haystack. And Gordon's efforts to mediate the powerlessness he feels with his school teachers, with the men who come to clean the cesspool, with the Christians, with the boy next door, with the boy who comes, this boy Adolf, who has a hare lip and whom he finally dispatches with a hoe. All are attempts to find a way to manage the world around him so that he is not absolutely bereft of power. And to a great extent, he does this through play, and he does it through imagining, and he does it through language, through various tricks of language that he has. He believes that, for example, that he knows where there is a secret sand in the sandbox, that down underneath the sand on the surface, there's a kind of sand which is denser and seems to be wet. Of course, it's not really wet, it's just drier or not less warmed by the sun. But he believes that he has the courage to put his hand down in the corner under the surface sand, down there where little crab-like things may be in the sand and could bite his fingers. But if he can only secure that sand, you see, then he can make a haystack out of his pail that will withstand that will hold together in a way that Andy Lieblich's and Stephen Adolph's would not, because they don't have the courage to go down underneath the surface of the sand. Now, of course, all this is preposterous, but none of it is preposterous to a 6-year-old. And I think if we can recapture, which is virtually impossible to do, of course, and thank goodness, I suppose, that that's the case, if we could recapture the full measure of what it was that we thought and felt and believed when we were 6, we would be overwhelmed with the richness of that texture. Just the other day, I heard someone say, "Oh, he's not my cup of people." And I can recall, of course, it was a mistake, but it put me in mind of an apprehension that I had had when I was a little boy, of just the same kind, of people saying cup of people. I didn't understand cup of tea. He's not my cup of tea. I didn't understand that, and I really saw people in a cup in some kind of way, or a person in a cup. We all of us know how children misapprehend hymns and songs and pledges of allegiance and all that sort of ceremonial language of youth. And that's to a great extent what Peru is about. I can recall when I was a boy hearing adults say that this or that child might or might not get there. And get there to them had to do with a kind of success that could be measured. I don't know how I got this notion in my head, but get there seemed to me to be something to do with Florida. You got there when you went to Florida. Florida was there. And so that all through my early youth, I had the notion that people who went to Florida, in fact, got there, and that people who did not never did get there, and that one of the ends of adult life was to find oneself in Florida. I put this before you because, to a great extent, it's a theme present in the book that I'm working on now, the novel I'm working on now. But it seems to me that this really is what we are when we're 5 and 6 and 7. We are collections of masses of misinformation, immense misinformation. There's very little in our lives that is real. It's all really magic. And this boy, Gordon, who tells us the story of Peru, is a boy who's overcome with misinformation and who believes himself possessed of magical powers. And when he speaks to us as an adult who has, as you know, suffered the witnessing of a horrid event on television, and then the following day is involved in a sort of farcical accident with a taxi cab, what he's put in mind of is through the hysterical event that is brought about by these two experiences, what he's seen on television. He's seen a piece of violence on late-night television, some news footage, and the next day, in the course of his hurrying along to get his boy off to summer camp, he suffers an accident with a sort of ludicrous accident with a taxi cab. It all puts him in mind of an experience in his youth, which may or may not have really happened. What we do know is that indeed he did live next door to a boy who seemed to have more than he had. He did have a great affection for a school teacher. It is interesting to observe that that teacher's name is Donnelly, and one of the persons dedicated, persons to whom the book is dedicated is named Donahue. Both are extremely tall. Much is made of that. There are a lot of parallels of this kind in the book. The book, as you may know, is shot through with these mirrorings. The hair lip that is in place in the boy who is the victim of the bludgeoning occurs to the speaker as wet and pink looking, and this evokes the sex play that the boy has had down in the cellar with his neighbor's sister, as it does invoke the boy's notion of what's underneath the shoe that his father wears. His father wears a strange shoe, and it's only off when the boy is in the shower with the father, but he's afraid to look and see what it is. He's convinced it will be wet and pink-looking, and that something comes off it called cess, and that cess goes out into the so-called cesspool outdoors where the men have come to see to things.
Well, you said a moment ago that children are filled with misinformation when they're 5 and 6. That's true, but there's a plus side to that, because as one becomes older and the years add on to your life, I think images become less distinct. And I know that I can look back in my childhood when I was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and see images so vivid. I can remember these details so well. I'm not sure that, I'm almost 50, I'm not sure that I can remember as clearly the things that happened to me last year and the year before, or 5 years ago, as well as I could, well as I can, my childhood. And isn't that the same with all of us?
Oh, yes, indeed. I'm absolutely certain this is the case. I'm certain, too, Don, that anything that you feel is true of yourself is true of all of us. I think that we are alive to ourselves, and the world is alive to us in ways, when we are ages of that kind, that are never replicated again in life, that we begin to move farther and farther away from ourselves. Certainly in the execution of Peru, it was clear to me when I began to think back to what life was in fact like for me when I was these ages, how vivid all those experiences were. They don't show up in the book, but the vividness is behind them, so that I knew that when I went forward with the book, I had to make all of this boy's world extremely vivid to the reader, because life was like that for us. First of all, it was not cluttered with so very much. We had so much less on which to concentrate. This is a boy who, when he goes to school, hears the corduroy whale, the whale in his corduroy pants making a sound, and that's a voice to him, and it talks to him. He feels he has a companion on his way to school and his way home from school. That would not be present for us at the ages we are now, Don, because our minds are cluttered with the business of the day. If we were walking from home to the office, we'd think about all the things that must be done at the office.
And
all
yet,
the things that
once in a while, you'll be walking in the suburbs, and there will be somebody burning a fire, and there's an odor that comes, an odor that you haven't smelled for 40 years. But you remember smelling that same odor when you were 10 years old.
Certainly the genius of Proust, I know. Certainly the genius of Proust. And this is a boy who remembers things that way. He remembers his mother and his teacher and his friends in relation to their smells. He remembers the boy next door in respect of the cocoa butter smell his hair had and the citronella smell his body had. I didn't even know I could remember something like citronella until I put my mind to it. I don't think anybody I ever smelled particularly strongly of citronella any more than I did.
I'm not sure I ever smelled it. I'm not even sure I know what it is.
The citronella was a rather commonly used material substance to keep off flies and fleas and mosquitoes in my youth. There were two palliatives for the problem. One was citronella, and the other was punk. One burned a substance, heaven knows what it was, but you lit it, and it smoldered very much like incense. And you held it aloft.
I remember rubbing material. I lived in the Midwest and in Texas, and we had terrible mosquito problem. And I remember rubbing greasy material, but I never knew the name of it.
Oh, that was probably a citronella. There's an oil base to it.
You also play a trick on your reader outside of the episode that apparently takes place in Peru, which Gordon sees as an adult on television, the violence on the roof of this building. This book has nothing to do with Peru. I'm sure that you're going to find some of our Latin American friends who are going to be grabbing this up to read all about Peru, and they're going to be disappointed.
Well, Peru, it seemed to baffle the reviewer for the New York Times what the intention and the title was. It did not baffle other readers of the book. It's fairly straightforward. There are two exotic place names in the book. Togoland, which is where the taxi driver comes from, in the farcical episode near the end of the book, or really all the way through the book, since the book is built in that fashion, and Peru. And if either of these places is intended to mean anything other than what they very lexically mean in the book, it's that there are places where exotic things do happen all the time. There are places where people don't speak the language of Spanish, they speak the language Peruvian. There's a place to go when he's in the taxi cab at the end of the book and he feels he's escaping all of the tedium of the quotidian. This accident has happened, he's banged his head, and suddenly life has come apart for him, and he's going to race away from all these entrammeling circumstances to something freer, something more like childhood, where the exotic things can happen, something like Togoland, someplace he doesn't know a thing about. So all that Peru is intended to suggest here is a place where things are magical again and exotic again, where strange, unexplainable things happen, where people shoot each other and at the same time stab each other and seem to be enjoying doing it. That's what he's seen on television. He seems to see in this news footage of a prison break, he seems to see a kind of reciprocity in the violence, as if it were almost a sexual experience, a dance involving a giver and a taker, willingly, a kind of connivance between the two. And where he wants to go is a place that brings back all that strangeness. If you recall, when he's young, he thinks about the neighbor's house, the Liebig's house, as if it were a kind of castle, very much like the castles that are shown him in the picture book that Miss Donnelly shows pictures of to the kids in class. And he thinks that the Lieblichs are like royal people who can come down from their turret and reach out their hands into the walls and dig out handfuls of edible stuff. It's all candy. Their lawn is candy. Their house is candy. Life is like that. Indeed, I don't think that's a terribly strange notion either. I think when I was a child, I often had the feeling that things were edible that were not edible. I would look up and see in some place I'd never been before a white building. And I would think that there was somehow like whipped cream, or somehow like ice cream, that there was a strange building that it couldn't in fact be consumed. Maybe it was just marzipan, you see. But it was edible. In any event, Peru is simply to suggest this kind of place where all the things that represent the strange admixture of fact and fantasy and youth, of horror and wonder, of truly the awesome, are suffused with each other, they mix with each other, they cannot be separated. And it's a better place, by implication. However horrible and however horrible, it's a better place than the place he's living in now, where he has to squabble with his wife over whether we take a taxi cab or not, or whether we carry the trunks down, and whether we buy a black and white television, and so on and so forth. So that Peru is a place to fly away to. And at the end of the book, in the episode in the taxi cab, when he in fact is en route to the emergency room of the hospital, he has a feeling that the cab is lifting up off the highway, off the street, and that he is somehow being released from all that holds him down in this adult life he now has.
Well, one last thing I want to ask you about. Reading Peru shows me that you have not abandoned your obsession with words and with the way things sound. Certainly you've done that in your other books, and Peru is a classic example of that. So apparently, for you at least, Gordon Lish, there's not going to be anything as a so-called straight book.
No, I hope not. I certainly hope not. I'm working on a novel now that I began really before I began Peru. I've been at it for about 4 years now. I don't expect I'll produce another novel after this one. I hope it won't be like anything anyone's ever done before, including me. And there'll be a short collection of stories as well. But I would hope that each time I do come to the page, that I come to it with enough strength to make the page different from the page that I've just come to.
Well, I hope all this writing is not cutting into your editing work over at Knopf.
I still do that. I still work as an editor at Knopf, and I hope to do so until they push me out the door, and I continue to teach at Columbia and NYU and my private master class. And all these things really are activities, Don, which I think abet one another. I don't think that, in contradistinction to what the usual complaint is, that time away from my writing, doing my teaching or doing my editing, is time which I pay a price for. In fact, I think it inures to the benefit of my writing. Every time I'm in touch with my students and illuminate for them something, it's an illumination for me as well. And the same thing is true of my writers at Knopf. It all is a piece to me.
Well, your work is an illumination for me as well as your presence here, because I've always enjoyed talking to you and finding out how you think and how you work. So it's important for me. And so I know we'll be joining forces again to talk about subsequent books. And I thank you very much for spending this half hour with me.
Don, you're immensely kind. Thank you.
Let's talk about Mourner at the Door and the stories. Of course, Mourner at the Door with all of these very unusual stories is a continuation of your obvious preoccupation with language. And I don't know if all of the themes are the same, of course, as in your earlier book, Peru and in Dear Mr. Capote, but certainly the language is very unusual. So I'd like to ask you why you have taken this very unusual approach to writing instead of just, as John Barth would say, just a straight story.
Don, I'm trying to recover the language as it occurs in my heart, in my ear. I have a notion that, to a great extent, the language we use is largely acquired later in life as a means of keeping at bay the world around us. It's a normative language, which very likely does not really have an organic relation to the fiber of our beings. And I'm a fellow who grew up in a family where cliche was the usual means of communication. And indeed, my mother, at whose knee I learned my language, was given to repetitions. So that it seems to me altogether appropriate for me to speak in the terms that you see on display in some of the entries in Mourner at the Door. My feeling is that it's a comparable matter for all of us, that we are all of us, by virtue of our being in the world, driven away from the language which is really innate to us. There's a kind of language in us all, a kind of grammar, which is, by my lights, integral to our biology, almost a genetic disposition that is peculiar to us. And my concern is to find a way to retrieve that language as a way of getting my own being on record.
But our writing is usually done in the form of shorthand. When we write a story, when we write a novel, all of the elements are not included. For example, the transitional elements of walking to a door, walking down the street, or walking over to pick up a telephone, and these sorts of things are usually left out because they're implied. But in your stories, in many of your stories, there are redundancies and repetitions, and it's true that we all talk like that. There's no question. But look, in The Death of Me, I wanted to be amazing. I wanted to be so amazing. I had already been amazing up to a certain point, but I was tired of being at that point. I wanted to go past that point. I wanted to be more amazing than I had been up to that point, and on and on and on.
Yes.
Can't you just say that in a single sentence?
Yes, no, you can't, because you see, Don, my aim is to enclose the reader with the effect of the speech. In much the same way that television encloses all of us, or in the way that the Bible or Freud encloses all of us, my intention is to find a way to come onto the page so that the reader is enshrouded in the ambiance of my voice. I.A. Richards took the position that the mission of communication was to move a certain unit of information from one person to another person. My position is that the mission of communication is to generate desire in those who come to the page to read the work, to create in that person a sensation of being enclosed by a certain kind of atmosphere, which atmosphere promotes in the reader or in the listener a sort of gaze, the way a great painting or a great piece of music might promote in you a gaze, a kind of hummy, buzzy, drifting feeling into which you gleefully escape. I'm trying to use language much in the very same way that a painter or that a musician might use language, to promote that buzzy feeling in those who come to my pages, in order to enclose them utterly in the possibility of escaping their immediate terms, escaping their own bodies, and drifting in some kind of meta-language, some kind of meta-place.
But you are so consumed with the language that sometimes, I think you told me a couple of years ago, and this has stuck in my mind ever since that time, that the story isn't as important to you as the way the story is told. Am I accurate?
Absolutely. I think for grown-ups, all stories have already been heard, and I don't think there are any new stories that we're likely to hear. I think what we are likely to hear, what we need to hear, is the authority, the authenticity of a human heart, and its pulsations. And I think what we all crave is that presence, that human presence. I don't think we need any more information to manage our lives. I think what we need is more sensation to manage our lives. So that I'm not really concerned to put before the reader a kind of format in which the news or in which the story is delivered to him. What I really want to put before the reader is the possibility for dream, the possibility for feeling. I think this is what we're chiefly deprived of and what we always crave. I think we don't get enough of it when we're young. I think we never get enough of it. I think we require it terribly in order to fall out of the complication of our own lives, in order to relieve ourselves of our own singularity and drift in some kind of mystery. So no, I'm really not concerned to set down some kind of consecutive sequence of information that one could call story. I rather imagine that there are no stories that I could invent that haven't been told time and time again with more eloquence than I could ever manage. What I have the prospect of doing, that perhaps other writers may not want to do, is to put before the reader the very prospect of my heart, what its pulsations peculiarly are. There's no story attached to that at all. It's happening all in a kind of a single place. So that really, if you look at my stories closely, you'll see that the very first sentence is virtually all of the story, and everything that follows is a kind of dilation of that sentence. It's simply evolving that sentence, elongating it, transforming it, until it becomes a kind of global sentence, a kind of global event.
And yet, you're not dismissive of writers who don't write like you, are you? For example, there's a young man, there's a medical student named Ethan Kanan. He doesn't write any way like you at all, and his short stories, which I thought were rather nicely done, are actually little novels.
Kanan is a superb writer. I know the collection, The Empire of Air, and was instantly envious of its excellence when I saw it, wishing that I might have published it at Knopf, because, as you know, I'm an editor at Knopf. Wishing, too, that I might have had entries from it in the Quarterly, because I put out a literary magazine whose business it is to present the work of young writers. Kanan would have made a marvelous contribution to the Quarterly. I am, in producing the Quarterly and in prosecuting my assignment as an editor at Knopf, always publishing writers who are as far from the kind of modalities that I practice as I can find. Heaven knows there's quite enough of me to keep myself busy, and I am scarcely interested in replicating myself in the pages of the Quarterly or at Knopf.
What, when you're still teaching, aren't you?
Oh, yes, I teach.
What is your basic message to your students?
Tell the truth. Tell the truth. Tell all the truth. Tell every bit of the truth. Reach deep down inside themselves to find the quiddity which is their peculiar truth. You cannot tell the truth with an italicized the. What you can do is tell what you feel, what you know, what you see, what you hear, what you taste, utterly and entirely. And to come to the page with the intention of doing other than that is to come to the page fraudulently, falsely, and uselessly. My notion of the writer is that he is at his best modality a high priest. He delivers the Blessed Sacrament. He puts into the hands of people what it is to be alive, what it is to have a death, what it is to have a life. You can't do that if you cheat. You can't do that if you only tell half the story, as it were. You have to deliver all of yourself. Nothing else will do.
I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean. You say to tell the truth. A writer doesn't have to. A fiction writer doesn't have to tell the truth.
Of course not. You're using the truth in the terms that I decry. He doesn't know the truth. He has no possession of the truth. None of us does. What he has only possession of is the validity, the authenticity of what he perceives. And this he is, I think, required to bring to the page, if in fact he is a literary artist. There are persons that I think the French expression for them is right